Hey, what's going on everybody? Today I'm going to show you how to set up virtual machines, kind of how they work, the general concepts of them, and how to get one up and running very quickly for yourself. Now, fair warning, there is going to be a little bit of theory and terminology in this video, but it's a little bit necessary in case you go and do your own research, then at least you'll know what everybody else is talking about. But basically, I just want to outline how to get started with virtual machines, what the concept is, and easy ways to get started, and also kind of what the pros and cons of each hosting method are. So quickly, let's just get the basic terminology out of the way for those of you who need the real information. First, the software or whatever that hosts a virtual machine is called a hypervisor. This is what takes care of the emulation that is necessary to run your virtual machines. And there's two main types of them, which is just type 1 and type 2. Now, type 1 is referred to as bare metal, and type 2 is referred to as hosted. Now, this might sound fancy and complicated, but let me tell you that it isn't. Instead of referring to these as bare metal and hosted or type 1, type 2, whatever, you can just think of it as installed like an application or installed like an operating system. A type 1 or bare metal hypervisor is installed basically like Windows. So just think of Windows being installed on a PC for this. You have the hypervisor actually installed as a primary operating system. And then type 2 is installed just like software on your existing computer. Think of just installing Microsoft Word, Microsoft Office, whatever. It is a program that runs on top of your operating system, which runs these virtual machines. And these are the main differences. Now, there are quite a few caveats and complexities as well as other different types, but we're not going to be concerned about those in this video. We're just going to be focused on these two main types and the bare basics. Now let's just talk briefly about the differences between these two different types. Hosted hypervisors are pretty much the easy way. It's easiest to get your feet wet with these. They run on an existing operating system, like I already said, Windows, even Mac, and they have the ability to run basically just like an application on your existing computer. And these programs, at least the common ones, are VirtualBox, VMware Player or Workstation, and Parallels. And Parallels is specific to Mac operating systems. These are where I would recommend starting, and this is actually what I'm going to be setting up in this video. Now, bare metal is kind of the more complex option, but it does give you better performance overall. If you're really serious about using VMs and on a regular basis, like you're not just messing around with them, then you might want to consider one of the bare metal options. They also come with some more advanced features, and the reason for the better performance is just because it's installed directly on the hardware. It's not having to run like a software application. It's interfacing directly with the hardware that you're running the virtual machines on. And there's a few of these, such as ESXi, which is VMware ESXi, Microsoft's Hyper-V, and KVM, which is one of the most popular Linux versions of a hypervisor. And there's a few others out there like Proxmox and Unraid, but generally these will come with a customized version of KVM, so that kind of encompasses those two. And there's others which I won't be talking about, mostly because I can't think of them off the top of my head. But these are the main players that you'll see. And one caveat here that I need to mention, and it has to do with Hyper-V. Technically, it's a Type 1 hypervisor, bare metal, but it can be installed through Windows as a feature. So the difference here with Hyper-V is that after you've installed Windows and you add the Hyper-V feature, essentially it converts the existing Windows installation into a virtual machine. And then that in turn runs over Hyper-V. So by far, Hyper-V is the easiest way to install a bare metal hypervisor, because you enable it as a service and then it basically just installs itself between Windows and your hardware. And if you didn't know any better, you would think that it was actually a Type 2 hypervisor. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and set one up. Now in this video I'm going to be using VirtualBox. This is, in my opinion, the best place to start playing around with VMs. It's supported on both Windows and Mac, and it's completely free. VMware Player is actually a close second. It has its advantages when it comes to certain types of VMs, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this video, and VMware Workstation is a paid option, so I'm not going to be recommending that as a starting place. So if we just Google VirtualBox, it is made by Oracle, so we'll go ahead, browse to the website, and go to the download section. And here it is actually for Linux and Solaris, in addition to Windows and Mac. But we're going to go to VirtualBox 6.0 builds for Windows hosts, because that's what we are running. And we're just going to go ahead and save that to our downloads folder. And you can go ahead and run through the installer, set it up. It will install some new network interfaces specific to VirtualBox. Those are virtual network interfaces which are used by the VMs that you'll create. Can't remember if it asks you to restart or not, but if it does, whatever, reboot. But once that is running, you will have a screen that looks like this. Now I've already got 4 virtual machines here set up, just kind of ignore those for now. We're going to go ahead and create a new one from scratch. So to create a new virtual machine, we're just going to go up here to New, and we're going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it My VM, and by default the machine configuration is going to be saved in your users folder under VirtualBox VMs. The next thing we have to do is designate a type. We've got Windows, Linux, Solaris, BSD, IBM. Pretty much just pick what operating system you plan to install on it. So for this, we're going to use Windows, and here we can select exactly which version we're planning to install. So for this, I am planning Windows 10 64-bit. We'll go ahead and click Next. Now it's asking us to designate how much RAM we want to assign to the VM. Now, you cannot exceed the amount of physical RAM that you actually have. Typically, this amount is blocked off as soon as you boot the machine. So if the amount of RAM you specify here is not available, it's not going to start. The RAM is not shared between your virtual machine and your actual computer you're running it on, which is not the case for CPU cores, which we'll get to in a minute. Just know that if you have a computer with only 8 gigs of RAM, you can't set it to 20 gigs and expect it to start. Set it to something realistic, and VirtualBox even recommends a memory size for you. Now me, I've got 32 gigs of RAM, so I'm just going to give it 4 gigs. Actually, we're going to give it 8, because really, in my opinion, Windows 10 should not be running on anything less than 8 gigs of RAM. We'll hit Next. And here it's asking us to specify our hard drive options. Now this is the coolest part about VMs, at least in my opinion. Instead of having a dedicated storage device like a hard drive, it just creates a file that acts as a virtual hard drive. And you can move this file around if you need to, and you can attach it to different hosts if you want to. And this is actually where the file type comes into play. Really, you just specify an amount of space that you want the VM to have, and then you click Create. So this one, it says the recommended size is 50 gigs, but this window right here, if you don't want to add a hard disk right now, you'd select that. So if you're bringing in an existing virtual hard drive, you would select this option when you're creating it so that you can attach the one you already have later. If you're just making the new one, obviously create new now, or you can go ahead and attach your existing virtual disk file. And here I've only got one available, and that's one that's already connected to another virtual machine I have. So for this, we're going to create a new virtual drive now, hit Create. Now it's asking us the type. You've got VDI, VHD, VMDK. Don't worry too much about this, but know that different hypervisors will sometimes use different file types for their virtual disks. So while VirtualBox uses VDI, Hyper-V uses things like VHD, or VMware uses VMDK, and you can actually convert between them if you need to, but generally you'll stick to a certain file type. I'm going to pick VDI since it's a VirtualBox VM, but VHDX is also one that's a little more common. Really, you don't have to worry about this option if you're just spinning up your own VPN and only using VirtualBox, but just know it's possible to convert between different ones, and maybe one day you'll want to move your VM from VirtualBox to Hyper-V or something, and then you might run into the file type issues. So we're going to go ahead and click Next with VDI, and now it asks us if we want that to be dynamically allocated or a fixed size. This is also one of the cool things about a virtual machine. We can assign it a size, like say we want this to be a 100 gigabyte hard drive. We can assign it 100 gigabytes, and it'll show as 100 gigabytes in Windows once we install it, but the actual file size of the virtual disk is only going to take up the amount of space that is taken up on the virtual machine. So if our Windows installation and our applications only take up like 12 gigabytes, the virtual disk size is only going to be 12 gigabytes, even though it is showing to the virtual machine as a 100 gigabyte file. Now, a caveat to that is if you over allocate your hard drive, say your hard drive only has 300 gigs and you assign 500 gigs to a VM, once it butts up against the limit of the actual hard drive it's stored on, your virtual machine will most likely shut down, stop working until you can figure out that size problem. So I'm going to leave that as dynamically allocated, and I'll just say that it's going to be 50 gigabytes because why not? And then once we hit create at the end, we now have our virtual machine on the left side called My VM. Now there's a couple other options that you might want to set that are not included in that setup wizard. So we're going to go ahead and right click on this virtual machine, go to settings, and let's go ahead and start with the processor. It's under system, processor. By default, it's going to give it one virtual CPU, but sometimes you're going to want to allocate more to it. And all these CPUs means is like the number of logical processors the computer is going to have. So don't worry about cores versus threads versus whatever here. If you want 4 threads, assign it 4 processor cores. And you cannot exceed the number of cores that your actual processor has. But also don't worry too much about the processing power because it'll be split between the VM and the host. It's not going to completely kill your operating system if you max out the cores. The host process is always going to have priority, but different hypervisors do deal with this in different ways. I know VMware will round robin CPU cores between all of the different VMs if there's multiple. Anyways, don't get too hung up on the CPU cores. I'm going to assign mine 4. Now the next option that you might want to look at is the network adapter. Oh, and one other thing that I forgot to mention is these two down here, the extended features. Enable nested is one that I sometimes use. If you use any other type of emulation software, like for example GNS3 or EvenG, where you're emulating network devices, it requires that nested virtualization be enabled. Now I don't know if VirtualBox actually runs those programs. I know that used to you had to use VMware Workstation, and that was one of the benefits of the VMware hypervisor was that it could actually do the nested virtualization. But I do believe that VirtualBox will actually do that now. But that's outside the scope of this video. So let's go ahead and move on to the network tab. This is another one you're probably going to want to look at before actually launching your virtual machine. By default, it attaches it to what's called a NAT adapter. And if we pull this down, you can see we have many different types of adapters, but we're really only going to concern ourselves with NAT, bridged, and a host-only adapter. And basically this is just where we want our virtual machine to fall on our actual network that we're on. If we set this to bridged, then this means our virtual machine is going to use the same network as our host that we've installed VirtualBox on. Just imagine that both your desktop and your new virtual machine are now plugged into the same switch. The VM is going to be active on your actual network and it's going to grab an address from your home DHCP server. Anything on the network that can talk with your computer can also talk directly with this VM. It's a regular device that'll show up on your network like one that's just in use somewhere. Now the NAT adapter just means that the virtual machine is going to be hidden behind a NAT wall. It'll still be able to communicate with everything on your network as well as the internet, but it's not going to share the same IP scheme, and other devices are not going to be able to talk directly to it. Basically, the hypervisor is adding a router between this VM and your actual host machine and your actual network. And this is usually the default because it doesn't hinder the VM's ability to connect to anything, but it also offers a little bit of protection through the NAT. Now the last one I'm going to talk about is the host-only adapter or the internal network. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as isolated. Basically, it's an adapter that is not connected to anything on your network at all. You can basically think of it as creating a switch out of thin air that is only going to be used for the virtual machine. So if we create more than one and we assign them these adapters, our VMs will be able to communicate with each other, but absolutely nothing else. For this virtual machine, I'm going to use bridge adapter because I want it to actually be a device on my network. And if you want to look at the advanced options, yeah, they're here. Sometimes, especially if you're running a virtual machine like Windows XP or something, you will need to change the type again to a different version. This is really just for driver purposes. The default is normally good 99% of the time, but sometimes you do have to mess with that. I'm not going to talk about the other options though. The last place I am going to talk about is the CD drive. It's under storage. This is where you can see the virtual hard drive that we created in the setup process. That's this one right here, myvm.vdi. And this will give you a little more information about it. The size, you can see the virtual size is 50 gigs, but the actual size is 2 megabytes. So our file is only taking up that amount of space. And then we can see where it's stored. But the CD drive, this is where we're going to actually install or put our operating system installation disk. Now we don't have to do anything with this right now through the settings, because the first time we boot it in VirtualBox, it's going to ask us to basically insert a disk. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. All of those settings that we made were just applied, and our virtual machine is ready to use. So let's go ahead. If we double click it, it's going to pop open a window, which is our virtual machine console, and here we get the select startup disk prompt. And we have a few options by default. We got host drive I, host drive J. Those are drives that are physically on my computer. And then we have some ISO options. If you've already used VirtualBox before, those will not show up by default. And the last one is this VirtualBox guest editions, which I will get to in a minute. That is also something that's pretty important. So if we click the little folder icon, we can add an ISO image. Now I already have the Windows ISO, but let's just go ahead and download it. So I'm going to Google now. We're just going to look for download Windows 10. And here the very first result, Windows 10 disk image. There's usually two ways to download it. One of them is just getting the ISO file directly. The more common way is to download this media creation tool. So we'll go ahead and save that to our downloads folder and run it. And this is basically just going to be a software installation type deal, which gets us our ISO file. The bad thing about this tool, at least in my experience, is that it takes it half a forever to get things ready, because really what this tool is used for is to actually update a Windows computer, and you're usually applying that update to the same computer you're running it on. So it goes through a lot of useless checks for our purposes at least, but we'll get the file we need eventually. And yeah, the next thing we're greeted with is, do we want to upgrade this computer or create media? We want to create the media, and I do want Windows 10. Actually, no, can't change that. So yeah, Windows 10 64-bit, click next, and we want to create an ISO file. Go ahead and click next, select where we want to download it to, and save. And now it's going to download the Windows 10 disk image. And I'm actually just going to exit out of that because I already have a Windows 10 disk image. We're going to go back to VirtualBox and select our Windows ISO file, choose that, and go ahead and start it. And now at this point, our virtual machine is booting, and it's going to boot straight into our Windows 10 installation disk. And it's going to immediately give us an error. So this is nice. Unable to allocate and lock memory. Virtual machine will now be paused. Close any application to free up memory. So basically what this error means is that I do not have enough RAM on my computer to fully dedicate it to this virtual machine. And that is most likely because I already have one VM running in the background, as well as all of this recording software. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to that and power off my other virtual machines. Now, VirtualBox has paused my VM at this point. It didn't completely shut it down. It just kind of saved the state, and it's there waiting for me to get enough resources for it to actually run. And now that other VM is closed, so we're going to go up to machine, and we're just going to unpause it. And at this point, we're just in a regular vanilla Windows setup. So this isn't a video about installing Windows. So just go next race through that, set up Windows like you would on an actual PC. And that is that. All right, and we are done with the Windows installation. And now you can see we have just a virtual machine with Windows 10 on it. We can now do whatever we want with this virtual machine. Learn on it, install stuff. It doesn't matter. Whatever our original reason for making this was, we can now do with it. But there's a couple other things that you might want to do right after installing a virtual machine like this, and one of those is installing those guest editions, as they're called in VirtualBox. If you're using something else like VMware, it's called VMware Tools. But basically what these are is they're just kind of VM specific drivers and things along that line. They also add some functionality just to make your life easier, like mouse pointer integration, clipboard carryover, monitoring statistics from the application. Sometimes they include the necessary display drivers so that your window will actually scale properly when you resize it. So like right now, if we resize this window, we're always going to have this ugly square unless we actually click on the background and go to display settings and change it. So to install these guest editions, we just go up to the machine, or no, we're going to go over to devices, and at the bottom you can see we have insert guest editions CD image. We're going to go ahead and click that, and that's automatically going to connect a CD drive to our virtual machine, which includes these tools. And now it is up to us to actually browse to that and install it. So I'm going to use the AMD 64 package because this is a 64-bit installation, and I'm just going to hit next until it's all finished. And it's asking us to install this thing, and yeah, we're going to install it. And it asks us to reboot here at the end. So once we finish, we'll reboot the VM, and when we come back into it next time, we will have these guest editions set up. And there we go, we're back into our virtual machine. It has the guest editions, and now it should actually perform better and have some more features. Don't ask me exactly what features it gave. I haven't looked that up. That's just one of those things that I always install and probably should have researched before I talked about it, but here we are, and I didn't. And I didn't try this before we actually installed that, but we should be able to auto resize guest display. That's under the view menu. If we go ahead and click that, what it should do is automatically resize, but it looks like it's, oh, yep, there it goes. I guess I disabled it and it just wasn't working before, but this is what it should do when you drag and resize the window. It should dynamically change the desktop resolution to match the window size. And like I just said, don't know if that was the case before we installed the guest editions, but I believe it wouldn't have worked right if we didn't. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is arguably one of the probably biggest advantages to running a virtual machine, and that is snapshots. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and if we right click on our virtual machine, we should have, just kidding, not right click. If we click this button on our virtual machine, we have a snapshots section. And since we haven't done anything at all we have is this kind of blank screen here to the side, and it says current state. And what we can do is we can take a snapshot, or we can do the settings and look at the properties and attributes and blah blah whatever. But if we take a snapshot, we can give it a name. We'll call this original. Click OK. It's taking the online snapshot. Basically, this is just saving the state of the virtual machine the way it is right now. And we can go back to that whenever we want to. So really, if we wanted to, we could just completely wreak havoc in here. Let's see what we can do. We're going to delete the public user folder. We're also going to delete, I don't know, all of program files. Let's see if that'll actually let me. Well, we require permission. Hold on here, see if we can get around that. Alright, let's see if that actually deleted program files. Oh, it didn't. Alright, so I'm not going to go through how to actually delete that, but just say you deleted a bunch of stuff. We got rid of our contacts folder, we got rid of all of our documents for whatever reason. Somebody deleted our music and our videos, and us not really knowing what we were doing somehow moved the taskbar to the top, and nobody knows how that happened. Look at that, Microsoft Edge on the desktop. It's a shortcut that is now broken. Now what we can do is, say we shut down the machine, we just gave up completely on life. What we can do is go to the snapshot and restore it back to its previous state. So you can see here we have a snapshot called original, and then we have the current state, which is now changed. So the state of the virtual machine right now is different than the state of the snapshot we took. So what we can do is we can right click on our original snapshot, click restore, and it asks us if we want to create a snapshot of the current machine state as well. We'll go ahead and do that, why not, just in case restoring this snapshot doesn't do what we want it to for some reason, we can go back to what it is now. We'll just name this one messed up. So now we've created another snapshot underneath our original snapshot called messed up, but since the play button is next to our original snapshot, that is the one that the machine is currently at. And you can see that the state has changed from powered off to saved. So once we boot it, it will be in a saved state. And we can see in our snapshots list that our save state is original. So now we are restoring the virtual machine. It's going to take it a few minutes depending on a lot of different things, but usually it only takes a little bit less than a minute, at least for a fresh install of Windows that hasn't had anything done to it. And here we go. We've got the taskbar at the bottom of our screen, and it looks like all of our files are still there. We've got the public folder back and our documents, our contacts, all of that. So snapshots are a very powerful feature. Most of the time in production, you're going to take a snapshot before you make any change at all if it's a actual virtual machine that is very important, just in case you do mess something up. Like if you're doing an update or migrating something, you're probably going to take a snapshot just so you have an easy way out if you mess it up. For the purposes of this, I actually use snapshots for some of my video VMs because I'll go in and I'll set up a unified controller, set it all up, and then the next video I'm going to want to set one up again and install some software, so I just revert my virtual machine to a snapshot so that it's clear and ready for the next video. But let's go ahead and exit out, and if you do just hit the X, it's going to ask you what you want to do with the machine. Powering it off is basically the same thing as holding the power button down, but we also get this option to restore the current snapshot original back to that state if we want to. We're not going to. Go ahead and shut that down. Let's restore the messed up snapshot, and we're not going to make another snapshot of the current machine state because it's pretty much in the original form right now. Alright, but we have gone to my VM, in parentheses, messed up. So once we boot into it, we should be back in that screwed up state that we made. And we'll see if any of our actual file deletions went through, because it should have a problem booting if they actually happened. But I have a feeling it didn't actually let me delete anything critical to Windows. Alright, and upon login, we are back to this crazy state that we made. Let's take a look at our users folder. Yep, public's gone again. Yep, we are just as messed up as we were originally. So that's a very powerful feature. And that's pretty much the last thing I'm going to go over here. This was a very winded video on something that's probably a little bit common knowledge now, but still, if you're new to learning about networking or virtual machines or anything like that in general, a lot of these concepts can be applied across the different hypervisors, and hopefully it just gives you a little bit understanding what's going on behind the scenes with a virtual machine. Even though this is VirtualBox and anybody can install it on their computer, it's not really meant to host anything. It still has many of the features that you would be messing with in an actual production critical environment. But anyways, hope you learned something. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below. And as always, happy networking.